And now I want to call on Vijay Prashad. He is the George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College. His interests include Middle Eastern politics, development economics, North-South relations, and current events. He's the author of The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, and 16 other books. And after today's talk, he will take some questions, and he'll also be back in Boston in 3 weeks to speak for the Boston Socialist Unity Conference. So if you are intrigued by his remarks today, you'll have another chance soon. Vijay Prashad.
Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. Okay. Thanks for coming. It's terrible weather, but nice to be here. This extraordinary built room, very modern church. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here because these are terrible times, and it's important for us to think together through these terrible times. And the gist of my remarks are going to be about the reason why the United States is militaristic. And I am going to make the case in 20 minutes or less that it's actually rational for the United States to be a militaristic power. It is not irrational. It is utterly rational. And it is the role of people like us to change the parameters of rationality. Because it's not enough to have a moral critique of American militarism. We need something deeper. We have to pull it out from its roots. Because militarism has become more than a habit in American life. It has become essential to the political economy of America. And that's what I'm going to present very quickly with 3 basic points that I want to make. And then, we can have a conversation now, later, and for the months that follow. The first point I want to make is a general point, which has nothing to do with Trump. See, one of the problems with kind of buffoonish leaders like Trump, and you remember when George W. Bush was there, it unites us in a kind of delight. How can this guy be the president? Remember George W. Bush? Same thing, can't spell, can't speak. Somehow it pleases people. It becomes easier to be critical of them. And then the left and the liberals unite. And we say, okay, we have this common foe. But then the Democrats come back and they give you somebody as suave and sophisticated as Barack Obama. Maybe even Bill Clinton had his own sophistication, charismatic, etc. And then the left liberal unity breaks apart. And then the left is in the cold. The liberals are there saying, just give them a chance. But actually the policies are in great continuity. There is a sharp decline when a buffoonish character is in power, perhaps, of sense, but the sensibility of the structure is the same. So instead of talking just about Trump, let's go back a little bit to the roots of the political economy. So the first point I want to make is I want to share with you the concept of military Keynesianism. That's the first point. It's a matter of no controversy in economics departments to understand that the way capitalism functions, it has periods of boom and then periods of bust. Now, it's true that a Soviet economist, Kondratiev, developed the curve and studied this with some precision. But nobody in a mainstream economics department, even at MIT, Harvard, these fine institutions of learning, debates the fact that there is an up and a downswing. In fact, in the stock market, they get cute with this. There are bulls and then there are bears. The market goes up, the market declines. There's a kind of oscillation. Now, in most sensible countries, rational countries, countries which had social democratic workers' movements, which put pressure on the ruling elites, in most sensible countries, they do something interesting to ameliorate the downturn. So when a government, a central bank or treasury department, the economists in the government detect that the economic activity is coming to a hot point, the top of the curve, and the decline is starting, at that point, governments come in and start to spend money. It's called counter-cyclical spending. Governments spend against the cycle, as it were, and try to ameliorate the downturn. Now, as I said, in most sensible countries where the workers' movement had a role in pushing policy, this counter-cyclical spending, this spending against the downturn, happened on the social side. So that at this point, you spend for education, you spend for health, you spend to repair infrastructure, you spend to create new infrastructure, subways instead of submarines, etc. Now, the United States is a curious country. And in this sense, it's an exceptional country. It's a unique country. It's a country that truly stands on its own hill. Because unlike most countries in the world, the United States, for 100 years, has done counter-cyclical spending on the military side. Instead of spending against the decline in this oscillating curve on the social side, where you increase spending for education, health, etc., here it's let's build more bases. Let's improve our military capacity. Let's give boondoggles to defense contractors. Let's upgrade our nuclear fleet, etc. Massive spending on the military side to make sure the economy doesn't crash into a deep, deep recession, when the downturn hits. So, no question that there is a rationality in military spending. Military spending allows the economy not to have a flat line, but to have growth and then to lessen the decline, have growth, then lessen the decline. Now, why is it that the United States doesn't spend substantially on the social side, that is, does conventional Keynesian spending? Why does it do military Keynesian spending? Now, economists don't have an answer to this. Here you have to understand politics. That's why economics departments are useful but very limited. They don't really understand how the world works. They can give you some methodologies, but they don't get it. They don't ask the fundamental question. So why is it that the United States for 100 years hasn't really done conventional Keynesianism? Well, there are many explanations. The one I find most compelling is the following. If you look at a social democratic society and you start spending universal health care and creating universal education and creating more parks, more public transportation, etc., the people in that country start having a tangible, concrete sense of living in a community. They are not atomized. They see their interests as united with the interests of their neighbors. That is, we all use the same schools, we all use the same hospitals, we all use the same public transportation. And guess what? We can meet in the parks, we have community centers where we can gather and have events, and there are also needle exchange places right next to the post box. It's bizarre. You go to Scandinavia, there are needle exchanges right next to the post box. I almost fainted when I saw that the first time. I thought, wow, they have, how can you mail your needles and it gives you a new one? They've rationalized, in a sense, society. But more than that, they allow people to have a consciousness or the feeling of living in a society. And I think this is very scary for the American ruling elite, because this consciousness is the basis for socialism. Now, they also had powerful and strong labor movements that fought for counter-cyclical spending to be on the social side. In the United States, if you ever travel to a military base, and I've been to a few bases, it's like being in a socialist society. These are gigantic communities. You get on the bus, you get off the bus. You walk into the commissary. It's an incredible world there. Public transport is free. You can do so many things for free. By free, I mean public goods are seen as social goods. They are paid for by taxation, and people enjoy them. They shouldn't be understood as free. They should be understood as social goods. They are goods of society. But of course, there's no risk in consciousness in creating social goods that are universal on a military base, because a military base is inherently hierarchical. Every 20 seconds, somebody walks by and says, yes, sir, yes, sir. It's an inherently hierarchical society. So there's no risk there expending social goods that you'll produce the consciousness of socialism. So in that sense, the United States is unique. The fear of socialism is so great here that public goods have to be destroyed. And privatization, therefore, which starts in much of the planet in the 1970s, is already basically normal in America. You know, the idea that social goods should be private is already pretty normal in America before neoliberalism, the slate that attacks the rest of the planet, arrives, you know, in the 1970s. It's already happened here. There is no real tradition of singular education. There was always private schools. There's no real idea of public or universal health care. There was always differential health care. All these social goods were already fractured, and there's no consciousness of a society in common. The atomization that takes place from the 1970s onward in the world is a routine matter in the United States. So the first point I want to make is that the root of military Keynesianism is very deep, and it's very hard to pull up. You can get rid of Trump tomorrow, but the real issue is, can you pull out the root of military Keynesianism? Can you pull out the root of military Keynesianism? Because, as Dwight Eisenhower argued, I think cleverly, and you know, in his initial statement, it was going to be called the military-industrial congressional complex. And later he said, I took out the word congressional because I didn't want to have too many enemies. It was enough to make enemies of military contractors, and it was enough to make enemies of basically the military. But I didn't want to also throw Congress in. But you cannot understand that from the 1940s, Eisenhower and others already understood that what had happened was military production and military bases, in other words, where military Keynesianism threw its money, was across every single congressional district. Every single member of Congress, in some way or the other, is committed to military Keynesianism. So you're going to rip out the taproot of military Keynesianism, you have to deal with this in every single congressional district. I live in Northampton, which you'd imagine is, you know, the closest thing in the United States to a small left-wing rotten borough. Firstly, our member of the Mass Legislature is Peter Kokott, who's at the head of the committee that wants to ban BDS in Massachusetts. So it's not all that progressive. But secondly, we have a military manufacturer in Northampton, in the city of Northampton. There's a manufacturer who makes sighting devices. They're called Cool-Morgan. So even there is military manufacturing. So what Eisenhower said was not that there is necessarily only a military-industrial complex, but keep in mind that word congressional, which he sadly took out of that speech. The first point, military Keynesianism. This is, in a sense, why I'm trying to suggest that we can't get rid of militarism without understanding capitalism. Point number two. You see, in the 1970s and 80s, when the world economy began to disarticulate, when factories broke up, and when American money began to rely on manufacturing all across the world, and so that, you know, everybody knows that a car is not made in one factory now, it's made in 20 different countries, and parts keep moving hither and yon and get assembled. When this so-called global assembly line was produced, it had to protect, that is, the United States had to protect something very significant. It had to protect transportation lines, it had to protect communication between these various sites, it had to protect intellectual property, hence there's a kind of hyperventilation about piracy, especially Chinese piracy, and it had to protect the idea of sound money, hence the threats about people manipulating currency, etc. The United States, from the 1970s, begins to have a new imperial role on the planet. This is not a role of, you know, some kind of irrational exuberance. You know, let's go out and bomb this country, bomb that country. No, this is actually a very studied and locatable kind of imperialism. This is an imperialism rooted in the global commodity chain. It's because of this that the United States, you saw, when the United States decided, for instance, after the Cold War to withdraw the base at Subic Bay in the Philippines. Initially they said, we're going to get rid of that base. Very quickly they returned and remilitarized Subic Bay. And militarized Eurasia even more, so-called encircled China. This is at the same time as Chinese manufacturing was going by leaps and bounds. militarizing the area around Southeast Asia, when Southeast Asia became essential to the global commodity chain, militarizing the Caribbean, when the Caribbean became even more essential to the global commodity chain, whether it's the Dominican Republic, all these colleges produce sweatshirts with the college name on it. All of these things are sewn in some Dominican or Haitian, one of the Caribbean countries. The remilitarizing very aggressively of the planet was to protect global manufacturing on behalf of the ruling elites, not only of the United States, but the planet. So now if you say, let's withdraw from our bases and let's withdraw from this and that, what you're actually saying is we have to change the nature of imperialism. It's not merely that we want the US out of the Middle East because we think these are irrational wars. These are essential wars. These are rational wars from the standpoint of people in power. They are there to protect shipping lanes. They are there to challenge countries with extra economic force to give the United States a better deal when they go into a discussion. I covered the UNCTAD meeting, that's the UN Conference on Trade and Development, where you see the Western countries come in and put immense pressure on countries of the global South. And they use a couple of different mechanisms to put pressure on them. One is they use what we call lawfare, war by law. They come in with about 100 lawyers, whereas these countries have nobody to represent them in the negotiations. They don't even have the money sometimes to print out enough copies of the negotiating documents. But the United States has about 100 lawyers. Then they show up and they threaten these countries, not just with economic sanctions, but they threaten them because they say, for instance, a news story comes out, we're going to now send troops to Australia. This sends a message to the Chinese. We're going to revamp our base in the Philippines. We're going to start moving our ships into the South China Sea more aggressively. This is a message to these countries when they're in the middle of a so-called trade negotiation, which is not really a trade negotiation. It's a negotiation over power. It's a negotiation over control of resources and how countries manage their own currencies. It's a control, in other words, over sovereignty. So warfare or militarism is not really, in the second sense, not really irrational even on a global scale. It's totally rational. From the standpoint of the elites, it's a completely rational device to have a massive global footprint. Which is why, when you look at the military budgets, and I make the same argument about prisons. I'm not going to talk about it here. If you look at the military budget, now it's going to be above 700 billion. We've all looked at these numbers. Trump is saying increase by 54 billion. The Russian military budget is something to consider. United States military budget, 700 billion. Trump says we'll increase the American budget by 54 billion annually. That 54 billion is 80% of the total Russian budget. That means 80% of the increase is the total Russian budget. It used to be, we used to say, the top 7 countries after the United States, if you add all their budgets up, Saudi Arabia, England, etc., if you add the top 7, then it's just about the total US budget. Now you have to add the top 9, and it's just about 10 billion less than the US military budget. This is not a waste of money as far as global elites are concerned. This is money well spent. And this is an argument I think we need to make to the American public, that there is a class dimension to military spending. When people like Trump walk around saying, I'm going to get you jobs, they are not going to get jobs for anybody because they're playing a shell game. He enters the conversation with jobs, that is with economic sovereignty, and then he ends the conversation on race, with cultural sovereignty. So all the trade conversations end with Mexicans. All the conversations about security end with Muslims. He starts with economic sovereignty and he ends with race, or he ends with cultural sovereignty. They don't have any answer for jobs. I mean, if you look at the data, 88% of job loss in the last 20 years in the United States wasn't because of trade. It was because of productivity gains and mechanics, robotics, ATM machines, check-in at the machine at the airport, etc. 88%. Why isn't he starting a war against machines? Why isn't he a Luddite? If he was to be rational, he'd be a Luddite. Say, let's blow up all the machines. I demand airlines hire people to stand behind the counters and say, nice to see you today, instead of forcing you to go use a ridiculous machine. But no, these people are not really about jobs. This is a class attack. On the one side, this class requires this massive military footprint around the world because it protects their global manufacturing position and it protects the solidity of the US dollar. It threatens countries into subservience so that they don't, act out. And it also allows other countries, if they buy enough US weaponry, to be protected. That's the protection racket that is run between defense contractors and the Pentagon. It's a weird thing. If Saudi Arabia buys a lot of American weapons, tens of billions of dollars of American weapons, then it can come under the US protection of the US military. I mean, why doesn't it protect itself? Why does it buy tens of billions of dollars and then require a US base in Bahrain, a US base in Qatar, US warships all over the Gulf? Why doesn't Saudi Arabia protect itself? No, it's a protection racket. If you buy weapons from us, we'll protect you. I want you to understand how this thing works. It's a crazy thing. So this is a class question. This is not a moral question. In other words, it's not enough to say I'm outraged that our precious, scarce public resources are going towards the military. Your outrage means nothing to them. Your outrage, they'll scoff at. They'll call you an idealist. In fact, it is rational for them to abuse scarce public resources in this way because they are advantaged in it. This is that very narrow ruling elite is utterly advantaged by it. It's a class attack on the population, which is not advantaged by it. And Congress is utterly complicit in this, whether they are liberals or conservatives. They will defend this massive, let's say, skeletal structure, which is now metastasized across the American landscape and has borne the entire country into this militarized political economy. Finally, very quickly, we are at a place where there are some shifts taking place. And this is directly at Trump. We are at a place with some major shifts. After the Gulf War, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when the Third World basically went into distress in the 1980s, for a period of about 15 years, the United States was, without question, the unparalleled unipolar power in the world. That's from 1990, say, or maybe the attack on Panama, 1989, till maybe the last 10 odd years. The United States was the unchallenged hegemon in the world. At that time, Russia had gone to sleep. Yeltsin basically was wanting to turn Russia into another state of the United States. China was at a position where they were building up the economic capacity by exploiting their labor in Shenzhen, etc., starting to become the major exporter. There was no real challenge to the United States. In 2003, thereabouts, when Bush went into his illegal war in Iraq, at that same time, Russia, China, India, these countries had emerged quite forcefully. And eventually they'll form the so-called BRICS bloc. But the BRICS thing is not relevant to us. What's relevant is the emergence of Russia and China. And the unity, new unity between Russia and China, military, economic, strategic unity. What they are beginning to theorize in Beijing, in Moscow, what intellectuals of those areas are beginning to theorize is that we have entered a multipolar world. Now there is not one pole in the world. There are at least 2 or 3 poles in the world. Obama was trying to manage the emergence of multipolarity, and Syria was the test case for this. When the Russians intervened into Syria, it's the first time that they've militarily intervened outside their territory since the fall of the Soviet Union. The September 2015 intervention was a signal moment when multipolarity had arrived. Trump now is continuing to manage multipolarity. But neither Obama nor Trump was able to change the cultural basis of this idea that America is the singularly most powerful country in the minds of Americans. And they are still therefore able to sell massive military spending on the basis that America is an unchallenged power, it's preponderant power, and it should continue this preponderance forever. A rational movement of the people would argue that we've entered a multipolar world and we should actually take some comfort in that. That why is it that the United States needs to meddle in everybody's affairs around the planet? Why can't we have regional entities taking care of different regions? Why do we still believe that only the United States can solve problems for other people? Why doesn't the United States decide not to be the one to set the terms of every conflict everywhere? So this moment of multipolarity, I would suggest, is a short-term opportunity for us to think about the role of the United States as a much more humble player on the planet. The problem is this humility is in total contradiction to the political economy of militarism in the United States, the first 2 points I made. So it is up to us, not to the ruling class, to figure out a new narrative to deal with this contradiction between the inherent militarism of this structure in the United States and the new moment we've entered, which is the moment of multipolarity. Thanks a lot. You want me to? I'll manage that. So let's have, I think, how much time? 10 minutes or so? 20 minutes of questions?
20 minutes.
Yeah, please. 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 But you'll have to speak loudly because you're far away from me.
I've not seen any evidence of what you said, that people in the American elite consciously, when there's a time of a downturn in the economy, they consciously then say, let's beef up military spending in bases, new weapons, whatever. My impression is, and correct me if I'm wrong, my impression is that the arguments for all of this are couched purely in some kind of geopolitical terms, whether it's a terrorist attack or back in the older days, some new development in the Cold War. It doesn't map onto, if you will, the ups and downs of the domestic or even the global capitalist economy. So I don't know if I've got it right or maybe.
It's very well put. So let me just repeat it in case you didn't hear. The argument I made was that there is I didn't use the word deliberate, but there is maybe studied or some kind of relationship where the ruling elite, when there's a downturn detected, instead of spending on the social side, they spend on the military side. Whereas it may be that they make their arguments for spending on the military side based on threat assessments or based on reconstruction of old material, etc. And maybe the timing is not always you're not always able to see the timing match. Right? So if there's an economic downturn in the 70s, do we see a major expansion in military spending, etc.? So this is a good point, and let me say two things just to clarify a little of what I'm saying. It is perfectly true that there is no so-called smoking gun where there's a memo. You know, we like to find memos from the United States, we brandish them around, National Security Directive number XYZ. When there's a decline in the economy, spend in the military side. So there is no national security directive that clinches the case, as it were. By the way, every time we have those NSD directives, nobody seems to pay attention to the fact that it's clinched the case. But still, it's kind of delicious to have one of those to wave about. So yes, you're right. There is no consciously stated, baldly stated policy of that kind. But if you look at the graphs, there's a tendency to see that this is exactly what's happening. So even if there's no stated policy of this, there is a kind of deep structure of harmony between downturn in the economic activity and upturn in military spending. The United States also has one other weapon in its arsenal in the downturn, which I didn't talk about because I didn't want to take too much time, and that is interest rates. And the reason it can use interest rates is because the dollar is a global currency. And I could make the argument that the dollar has been weaponized globally. You know, that's what happened in the so-called debt crisis in the 1980s when Paul Volcker raised the interest rates. It was called the Volcker shock. And that triggered the London interbank offer rate, which suddenly sent all these countries in the third world into deep crisis, and that was known as the debt crisis, third world debt crisis. It had nothing to do with the third world borrowing at that time. It was entirely to do with the Volcker shock, that this lever of interest rates is able to have immense cataclysmic effects elsewhere. They weaponize the dollar because other people use the dollar. Anyway, that's the other instrument that's been used during a downturn. So there's not only one instrument, the military spending, but yet there is this harmony over time. And you know, one of the interesting things is if you look, say, at the two periods when it appears that social spending has been increased, those two periods are the New Deal and the Great Society. These are the two periods where it appears as if social spending has increased. In fact, economists consider these to be so-called salvage periods, where social spending had declined so dramatically in the intervening years that it was increased just to come up to that 14% of GDP, which is the normal rate of social spending. In other words, it's not like social spending increased, but it had dipped so low in the 1920s, you know, during the Coolidge and Hoover administrations, that FDR basically brought it back to normal. He didn't increase social spending. Same with LBJ. They don't increase social spending above the 14% threshold. They bring it back because it had decreased during the 1940s and 50s. Some of that is because economic activity had picked up. America had all this surplus advantage from the war, etc. So my just quick thing is, there is no conscious policy that we have detected, but there is certainly the harmony, and it's enough circumstantial evidence to make the argument for military Keynesianism. Please. Okay.
Vijay, as usual, very good talk. Just want to make one observation, and that's, I think, your thesis about... can't be heard. Oh, sorry. Thought I had something on voice. Okay. Your thesis about the multipolarity giving us, the progressive movement, an opportunity to intervene in this system of world domination, which I agree, but also the imperialists are not staying quiet. They're fighting back. And one of the things that I point out, the Russian budget is actually about 53 billion, and Putin just slashed it down to 47. That's just one point. The other point is the role of India. So that's a point where the US is struggling very hard to co-opt a very big nation like India, which as a counterweight to this multipolarity. Even though India is a member of the BRICS, it is tying itself very closely to US policies in many respects. So that's the observation. And my question is, what do you think about this situation with the Trump being seen as friendly to Russia versus this neoliberal onslaught about that in the US politics?
I mean, so, okay, the observation was that in BRICS, you know, India is really a loose tooth in the BRICS movement because it's got this Janus face position. I mean, it's on the one side still in BRICS, and then it's currying favor with the United States and Israel. And, you know, there's this strange position. And India is a big prize. Because if you can win India, you've won a major diplomatic power that plays a role in corralling about the 170 other states in the non-aligned movement. It has a place in leadership over about 170 countries. So then imagine a resolution against Israel. It won't just be United States, Israel, Samoa, Guam. It'll be India, and then maybe 20 other countries might join, thinking if India joins, then we can join. Because they are not joining now because they don't want to join, you know, Solomon Islands, etc. They don't want to join these countries because they see it as a break with the non-aligned movement. So India's plucked away. If India is plucked away from this to the American camp, as it were, it will be a huge diplomatic advantage. Not so much military, diplomatic and geographical. That they have a big ally there. Because India still plays this duplicitous role. And I'm glad for the duplicity. It's okay. It's actually a kind of curious what an Indian strategist called non-alignment 2.0. You know, it's a different kind of non-alignment. But to your second point, which is, I mean, I don't know how many of you are capable of watching MSNBC any longer. It's exhausting. I mean, they are paranoid about the Russians. And you know what I would like to see from Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and people like that, I'd like to see them come out to the podium and say, look, I know you around the planet are perplexed by this. I admit that for about 80 years, we messed around in your elections. We didn't allow the communists to win in Greece in 1940, whatever it was. We messed up the election in Italy. We messed up the election in France. This is all in the 1940s. We overthrew Arbenz. We overthrew, from Arbenz to Allende. We intervened here. We intervened there. We're sorry about all that. Now we know what it feels like. That would be a moment of great integrity. I mean, especially Bernie. I'd like Bernie to come out. Cole, you rightly said that they kind of forget foreign policy. I'd like to see them take that position. Then we can talk about the question of Lucifer 2.0, whatever that handle is. Otherwise, if I'm looking at this rationally and not with my great disparagement and dislike of Stephen Bannon, it's interesting that people consider him an intellectual. If you watch any of his movies, it's bizarre. I mean, the guy is crazy. His movies are crazy. But anyway, he's right to talk about a deep state. I mean, that's a correct thing. I mean, it's not a surprise to us. It's correct. There is a deep state. There is a consensus politics that transcends the Republicans and Democrats. They are right to talk about the fact that there's no real willingness to shift the foreign policy consensus. That there is a way in which everybody gets harmonized into the politics of the deep state. So I think in that sense, Trump's comments about restarting with Russia might come from completely the wrong place. In other words, he sees Russia as a macho Christian kingdom of whites. That's basically Bannon's position. They are macho, Christian, and white. And therefore, they can be our ally against the Muslims who are brown and, frankly, disgusting. I mean, at one point, Bannon said that these people, meaning Muslims, Asians, blacks, etc., don't have Jeffersonian democracy in their DNA. The guy is an outright racist, So, but despite where they are coming from with the idea that we need to balance with Russia, the other side of it is interesting, but I don't want to exaggerate this. I'm very quickly going to offer, there are two mainstream strategies that are there in the Washington foreign policy circuits around how to control Eurasia. Two mainstream strategies. One strategy is befriend China and encircle Russia. And that's the strategy pushed by people like Henry Kissinger. Make China your ally and squeeze Russia. The other strategy is the Trump strategy, befriend Russia and squeeze China. I mean, these are two militaristic strategies. Obama's strategy was squeeze both. Encircle all of Eurasia. Get them in the South China Sea lanes and in Ukraine. Of course, that blew up. So none of these are actually progressive ways forward. There's nothing progressive in Trump. Nothing progressive. Even if the outcomes, that is to say, rebalancing of the world order, appear progressive, nobody should have any assumption, any illusions that this idea of, let's reset with Russia is a good thing for the world because because it looks like it will bring multipolarity forth. Actually, they want to exacerbate international conflict. Their enemy is to be China in order to dominate all of Eurasia. So I think this is something we should be very wary of. And this jumping on the bandwagon of the Russians have screwed up our election, at some point, people, this is what great powers do to each other. You've just forgotten what it's been like to have people challenge you. Yes, in the back.
Well, I wanted to ask a couple of quick questions. One is, you said there's military should be cyclical and we've gone into a more plateau. Is there a way to correct that? Another question is, I was listening to a talk by Jeremy Rifkin. He was talking about a third revolution with renewables, and Germany's done very well in renewables and now build an infrastructure. Is there any way to partner with, like Massachusetts, with another country where we can be isolating and work in tandem, because this is going to be chaos if we're just trying to figure out policies?
Actually, I don't know the answer to your second question because that's a legal question as much as anything. I mean, politically, I think it's interesting to see what other people are doing. But, again, we have to be wary when this administration talks about infrastructure spending. Then the next statement is it will be funded by private-public partnership. which is the code word for privatization. So, the chickens have really come home to roost. This is what the United States demanded that the rest of the world do. In order to balance your debt crisis, which was messed up by the Volcker shock, which we did in 1979, you're going to have to privatize precious social goods to raise money for the current account. Not for building up your infrastructure, but for current account spending. It will bleed you dry. That's what happened to most of the countries around the planet. This is why we have a situation where 5 people in the world have as much wealth as half the world population. That obscenity is a result of this policy. And I think that Trump wants to bring this back to the United States. Let's privatize everything and let people, have chips inserted in their arms. And it's like those science fiction films from the 70s. Logan's Run. Can you break free of the barrier? Or The Giver, everybody is going to be taken care of. You will be happy, believe me. Trump is not a fascist. Trump is actually a Nazi. You see, a fascist is different. Fascism is where the ruling class believes that they cannot manage order under liberal democratic conditions. Currently, the American ruling class doesn't believe that. It believes that ideology is sufficient, meaning why do you need to start locking people up when ideology is doing the work for you? So we are not in fascist conditions like that. But these guys are Nazis, and I'll tell you why. Because one of the core features of Nazism was, under situation of capitalism, social domination basically is entirely abstract. In the old days before capital, you could go and burn down the Lord's house. You could destroy a prince or hit a moneylender. Today, burning 10 ATM machines isn't going to end capitalism. So what the Nazis did was they embodied capitalism in Jews and communists, but mainly in Jews. They said, look, they are the reason you have no jobs. And the structure of Bannonist and Trumpist thought is the same. Look at the Mexicans. The Mexicans are the reason you don't have jobs. You pick on a community and you blame that community, or look at the environmentalists. They are the reason you have no jobs. So this is Nazi thinking. They are unwilling to confront the structures that enfold the world. They are picking on people as an explanation for why there is economic distress. That's why I don't believe we are in fascism. We are nowhere near fascism in the United States. But these guys are Nazis. Please. One more, yeah.
I really appreciated that number one point about the social spending building the community. But I do think it's also true that it's much, much harder to extract profit from the public sector, from building schools or building parks, building hospitals. Whereas the military sector, it's monopolistic, right? They can't give the contract to the Chinese. It's cost plus, and there's no audits because of national security. So the profit levels from military spending are vastly higher than what can be done out of the public sector.
Did everybody hear that? No. Okay, it's an interesting comment. The comment is that, well, one of the advantages of spending on the military side is that, well, it's national security, so you don't have to open your books. Secondly, because you don't have to open your books, you profit gouge as much as you want. And of course, there are monopolies because, Lockheed has a monopoly on this ridiculous plane, which is never going to be used, and they keep spending money and precious money goes in there. Right? Fair? And whereas social spending, how can you corrupt it? It's hard. You can do a little bit. Some corrupt hospital administrator can walk away with selling 5 incubators. That's not the same scale as military corruption. Fine. Completely agree with you. Which is why the underlying point of point one, and it's a great place to end, is that just so that, because, I believe this in my core as part of my own theory of life, we cannot end militarism without ending capitalism. It's not possible. J.G. Ballard had a line, the great writer. He said that one of the problems with the world is it's easier to imagine the end of the earth than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. In other words, we can have like 1 million films and 1 million books written which are utterly dystopic, where the world ends, where Godzilla comes and eats the planet up, where aliens come and fight us to the death. That's easy to imagine for us. But imagining the end of the profit motive, impossible. Now, you tell me why that is so. Thanks.
Thank you, Vijay. And Vijay,